Welcome to the Gridiron Expert. Next up on our team previews, we're going to be looking at the James Madison Dukes. And joining us on the show is Katie Harper. Katie, how are you doing?
Good, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, before we get into the Dukes for the 2025 season and going over each position group, Katie, please tell our viewers where they can find your content.
I am primarily over on Twitter with at Katie Harper, and it's just Katie with a C, and that's pretty much where all game stuff goes up there, all my stories and everything with that.
That's great. Well, looking at the James Madison Dukes for this season, and we'll start on the offensive side of the football. They actually have something that not a lot of G5 teams can say that they have, which is depth, especially at the skill positions. And we'll start off at quarterback. So they probably have a few guys who they feel confident with going out and taking that first snap of the 2025 season. But who do you ultimately feel like is going to be the starting quarterback? Or maybe I should put it into the perspective of who do you think will have the most snaps this fall?
I honestly, it depends on the week which way I lean. I really like Camden Coleman's game and what he brings after playing at Richmond for several years. And sometimes the reason I'm hesitant to say that I think he could be the starter is you then look at Matthew Sluka, who has extensive history with the JMU coaching staff from when they were all at Holy Cross. He had some of his best seasons under Bob Chesney and Dean Kennedy, the offensive coordinator. And then on top of that, Camden Coleman still has his red shirt to play with. So there is that option. Obviously, Matthew Sluka does not have that. He's in his last year. And so I go back and forth, and obviously, then there's the whole Alonzo Barnett question of all of this. We have not been told 100% what the injury is. We know it's a knee injury. We know it's non-contact, so you can kind of build off of that, of what it is. And he ended up being in spring practice just a little, didn't have any contact, very little plays that he could run, throws that he could make, couldn't really put pressure on his one leg. But even that was kind of a surprise to the coaches because they didn't expect him to be available at all during the spring. So his status is still kind of this giant question mark heading into the summer. If uh, if I had to pick a starting quarterback, I've been telling people Matthew Sluka just because of his age and his experience with the coaching staff, but I struggle to fully say that just because I think Camden Coleman has a very complete game that he can bring to the field.
And both Coleman and Sluga, yeah, they are. No, I don't want to say complete opposites, but with Coleman, you're talking more of a prototypical pocket passing quarterback, and Sluka still has probably some room for improvement in regards to his completion percentage, but he is a true dual threat quarterback. And by the way, for those watching, yes, this is the same Matthew Sluka with the whole UNLV NIL situation last year when things were not exactly put on paper in regards to that so-called contract or whatever. So, yes, it's the same Matthew Sluka that we're looking at here. Which quarterback do you think, Katie, provides a higher floor early on for the Dukes?
I honestly would go more with Camden Coleman in that one. I think with how much depth JMU has at running back right now and how much talent they then have at wide receiver, having a quarterback like Camden Coleman, who I think he still has the physicality to run if needed, but it's obviously not the same kind of run style as Matthew Sluka, who will literally run through someone. But I think
Yeah.
with Camden Coleman, just if you look at how this roster is constructed right now and you look at the talent that they have at running back, you don't necessarily need a quarterback that's going to take a third and long situation and scramble and rush for the first down because you have wide receivers then you can look at. So I think if it was something where JMU didn't have kind of this running back room bursting at the seams with talent, then maybe you do look at a Matthew Sluka who has the higher floor and the higher talent level of being able to run the offense. But right now, I would say, well, I think Sluka will probably be the starting quarterback just because of his age and experience with the staff. I do think Camden Coleman maybe offers a little bit more in terms of what they can succeed at as an offense.
Well, and you discussed that running back there shortly. So let's go ahead and look at the running back room. Yeah, this is awesome. So I mean, Wayne Knight, Iowa Day, who had some injuries last year, George Pettaway. Uh, they probably go what 4 or 5 deep here, but the top three are. This is probably the best running back room in the Sun Belt.
I think it's kind of easily at that point now because even in the spring portal, they added a transfer from Holy Cross who obviously knows the coaching staff, but then we're all kind of me and some of the other media members are looking at it and we're like, at no point did we enter the spring portal thinking, oh, JMU is going to go out and add another running back. Maybe it becomes a possibility if, they lose a player. I think some people maybe thought Wayne Knight would hit the portal just with Adeye coming back and Petaway still there. And then once Wayne Knight's brother left, people thought maybe that would spur him to leave. He didn't. So at that point, none of us thought that this running back room was going to add another person, and they did. But this group it's very talented, and I think you have a good balance right now of guys who can do different things. You have a Joby Mallory who can be your short down back, who can kind of just be a train and push through some people, but then you have kind of the elusiveness of a George Pettaway and an Io Adeye and a Wayne Knight, who also all three of them can factor into the receiving game. Pettaway and Knight especially showed that last year. And this all kind of comes with they brought in a freshman in Jackson McCarter, who I think is going to be really good in the future. Looked really good in the spring game, which is kind of when you expect your freshman running back to kind of show out because they're not going to use their main guys too much. But I think it also benefits them moving forward just because he has all these guys around him that he can learn from. So it's kind of a crazy, crazy running back room. Like any team last year, it was the position that they dealt with some injuries. You mentioned Adeye went down. They lost Tyler Purdy to a broken leg. So they're built to quite literally take hit after hit after hit in this running back room and still be okay and possibly finish atop the Sun Belt in rushing.
And what's crazy about this running back room is we mentioned those top three, and then you briefly mentioned Joby Mallory, um, who is probably going to be that short down and distance situations running back for JMU. He's listed fourth here at least at a lot of places that you look, and for most G5 teams, their short yardage back is like their second or their third guy. For JMU, it's their fourth guy, and we'll see what the underclassmen do. It could end up being their fifth guy in terms of like rushing stats this year, which is it just goes to say the quality depth of this room. So this is going to be not just one of the top, probably the top running back room in the Sun Belt. This is going to be one of the best position groups, not just in the Sun Belt for the G5, but nationally.
It is, and it's we talked with Dean Kennedy and Bob Chesney obviously throughout the spring about it, and I believe it was Dean Kennedy who said his favorite thing about this group right now is that none of them are trying to take the football and be the guy. If if George Pettaway has a good run, all of his fellow running backs are right there cheering him on and lifting him up and supporting him. And it was something that Adeye mentioned as he was going through his injury recovery last year that he felt so supported by this group. And I think that's maybe to the coaches, that is what's the most exciting is that, yes, they have all of this talent, but they're all still there and supporting each other and wanting them to just kind of see or succeed as a group.
And so they'll be running behind an offensive line. So that has some new faces this year, but their best player from last year in the right tackle, Pat McMurtry, is that right?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I believe he was first team All Sun Belt last year, and he is the only first team All Sun Belt player from last year that is still playing on the same roster as they did from last year. So he's the only first team All Sun Belt player from 2024 that's returning this fall in the Sun Belt. Is that correct?
It is.
Yeah.
And
Welcome to the day and age of the of NIL and the transfer portal.
it wasn't even a hard decision for him. We talked with him, and I mean, these are the coaches he's played his entire career with. He followed Chesney from Holy Cross, so for him, McMurtry was like this was pretty much once he knew that he was going to have the medical red shirt and have another year. It was kind of signed, sealed, delivered. He was coming back to Harrisonburg.
Well, that's certainly an awesome piece and player to have back on the offensive line. The rest of this offensive line, so they have some experience with some of the guys who have played some snaps over the last few years. So it's not like they don't have any other experienced players in the fold here, but there's going to be some transfers coming in to help immediately. Zach Greenberg, Cam McNair. How does this offensive line look to you from not just a starting five standpoint, but also second string, third string, and counting on that depth?
It looks good. I think it was something that we all saw last year. Um, Chris Smith, the offensive line coach, Bob Chesney, they love to rotate both on the offensive line and the defensive line. And so, you have some guys on that offensive line who maybe weren't classified as starters last year, but they were still playing significant snaps. And whenever the coaches were asked, especially in fall camp leading up to the senior or season about, who's first string, second string, they didn't even like kind of using that term because they wanted all of those guys rotating in and out. And kind of similar to the running backs, it ended up not surprisingly being a position group that kind of took some hits throughout the season. They lost Riley Robel, they lost Carter Sweezy, but those are two guys who are now back. And Sweezy was a starter. Robel technically was never listed. I don't think I would have to go back and check, but he didn't start, wasn't listed as a starter multiple weeks leading up to his injury, but he was still playing significant snaps. And so it's a good group. They did well to kind of bring in some guys that can help bolster a few spots because they do lose Tanner Morris and Cole Potts, who ran out of eligibility, and they were kind of the two fixtures on that offensive line for a very long time. But it's definitely a group that I'm not sitting here being like, oh, I don't know how this offensive line is going to hold up. I don't know if they're going to do well in creating the gaps for the running backs. I think it's a well-constructed group, and it's with a coach who I think showed last year that he's very strong at building that group up.
So they wouldn't be worried about like if they have an injury or two. They still feel really confident with the second. I know you said like they don't really like the term at first and second string, but they feel probably confident about what 8, 9, 10 plus players here.
I think so because I think because they were able to do it last year at a high rate of kind of replacing these guys as they went down. Carter Sweezy went down in the game against Louisiana Monroe. Riley Robel went down around that time too. It may have been a week before or a week after. And they were able to kind of just plug those holes and keep grinding and still have a good rush attack.
And then looking at the passing game, so we discussed the quarterbacks earlier. They could have a few quarterbacks on the field this year at different times. And they'll be throwing to a very deep receiving core. So depth is definitely not going to be an issue here. And I don't really think there's going to be any worry or concern with this group. I think potentially the only question here is who ultimately steps up to be the proven go-to guy. So who do you think is going to ultimately separate themselves to be the wide receiver one? Or do you think it's going to just be a balanced room where almost everyone has, say, 300 to 400 plus yards receiving?
I think last year it was kind of common for games to see that Alonzo Barnett connected with 7, 8, 9 different receivers, and you include the tight ends in that group as well. So none of them necessarily last year broke out and had a ton of yards. I think Omarion Dollison, who's now graduated, kind of ended up being the leading receiver in terms of yards just because he was such a deep ball threat. But or I believe it may have been Ymir Knight. I would have to go back and look at the numbers, but it's not a group that I'm sitting here going, you know what, it's going to be this guy that's going to be far and away the leading receiver just because of how much they like to spread the ball around last year. Obviously, that was with Alonzo Barnett. So I don't know, depending on the quarterback that they go with, I don't know if that quarterback will lock in on someone who's his number one target. I would say looking at this wide receiver room, I think it's better than it was last year. And that's even including losing Ymir Knight, who I think he's someone that could go and become a team's leading rush or leading receiver. And I don't think he was going to get that in Harrisonburg just because of how much they like to spread the ball around. I would say I don't know if he'll be the leading receiver in terms of yards, but I think he will be highly productive and end up kind of in the conversation for the All Sun Belt honors. And that's Jalen Sanchez, who is almost certainly going to be your go-to guy out of in the slot position. It's a position he played at Villanova, and I think he proved at the FCS level how talented he was. And so I think him coming here with the two wide receivers they brought in from Richmond and Nick DeGennaro and Landon Ellis, and then he brought in. I mean, they kept adding wide receivers. They brought in Alston from Iowa State. They have Dylan Williams, who's a sophomore who I told other people that I think he could be a breakout player, and that was before other commitments, but I still think he could be a breakout player. They have a freshman in Mikey Scott, who everybody who talks about Mikey Scott loves Mikey Scott and that he's so high energy and fast and quick. He's just small. So it's a group that kind of similar to the running backs, I think is just going to be one that's fun to watch.
Yeah, there are so many guys here in this wide receiver room that could step up and be quality targets this year in the receiving game. And we discussed the quality depth that James Madison has. Uh, this is something that most G5 teams cannot say because you look across the country and it's like they feel confident in say a few like really good offensive linemen, maybe a couple of backups, and then when it comes to the skill position, it's like first of all, can they even keep their best players? And then if they can have a quality starting lineup, they'll take that and they might have a couple of decent backups. You look at James Madison, it's like, yep, they got three really good running backs, and they're going to be end up playing like four or five guys that are going to see the field a decent amount. Receiving core, gosh, I mean, how many different receivers this year do you think might end up with a catch by the end of 2025? Like 13, 14?
I mean, if you're throwing in the tight ends in that group, yeah, I would think so because even last year they had multiple tight ends catching passes, and even the tight end that was viewed last season as the blocking tight end ends up catching a touchdown pass in the Boca Raton Bowl. So they have no problem dishing the ball out to multiple different people, and so yeah, wide receiver, it's going to be the quarterback who ends up stepping out on the field as a starter is going to have a lot of guys that he's probably going to love throwing the ball to.
And a lot of these guys transferring in have college experience. So it's not like, these are brand new guys having to step up into their roles. And so for those listening, before we even get to the defense, you're probably already thinking to yourself, gosh, JMU seems like they have all the pieces in place to make a run, at least for the Sun Belt Championship. And you'd be correct. You'd be correct with that thinking because the sports books that currently have the G5 championship odds available, James Madison is listed as the Sun Belt favorite everywhere you look right now. Not by a large margin, but they are listed as the favorite. So now as we look ahead to the defense, so the defensive line, just like a year ago, does lose some production, but there are some really exciting players here that have been in the program. Now they're just going to be stepping up into those bigger roles, and then they bring in a few guys through the transfer portal. So, Katie, go over this defensive line, and do you think this group has just as high of a ceiling as the last couple of years group did?
I think so. And this is kind of where it comes into the history of JMU. They have a really rich history on the defensive line and on the defensive side of the ball as a whole. I mean, I was a student at JMU from 2016 to 2020, and so that was, two different coaches in that time period, and the defense was great both time with both coaches, with Mike Houston and Kurt Signetti. And the defense then became good under Bob Chesney after Kurt Signetti left. And so it's always a group that has produced and it ends up at getting guys who maybe need to grow into their roles a little bit. And I think now on Bob Chesney's staff, he has Sam Daniels as the defensive line coach, who he himself has a rich history at JMU and is a beloved former member of that group of the defensive line under Mickey Matthews. And so I think he has done well to find the right guys that want to buy into the culture at JMU, and they've kind of found some hidden gems. Last year, Eric O'Neill fits the definition of a hidden gem. Long Island, from Long Island University, comes to Harrisonburg and just balls out and is now going on to play at Rutgers. And then, Kyrie Mans comes in from Colorado after being a star at Maine, and he also just fits the mold really well. And I think for this group now, losing some people, it just kind of opens the door for some other guys. Xavier Holmes played with Kyrie Mans up at Maine, and I think he's someone that can really be good as an edge rusher. I think Sahir West, he's young. He really showed out at the spring game. He was kind of the guy that was getting after the quarterback the most. I think he can grow into being a great player, especially since he was playing under Mans and O'Neal and he had that chance to learn. And that's just on the edge. When you look in the interior, Emmanuel Bush is about as NFL ready as a defensive tackle I've ever seen come through at
Oh.
JMU, just because of how big he is. And we were in their weight room ahead of spring ball, and he's just kind of benching to the max every single time. And big guy can still just produce even with his size. So it's a defensive line that I'm sure will be fine. And a lot of that, similar to the offensive line, is because of the rotation that they did last year. that I think they found the right guys to even, fill in to try and lessen the burden of losing an Eric O'Neal.
Yeah, and you were discussing Emmanuel Bush there. Yeah, 6'1", 315. And perhaps we might, do you think he's the kind of guy that would be listed on some of those freaks list?
Probably. We all got our introduction to Eric O'Neal I think the biggest introduction to him was the spring game of 2024. They did a big man punt kick contest.
Oh, okay.
And
Yeah.
they were supposed to, the plan was to see how many punts the big men could catch. Emmanuel Bush catches the first one and runs about like 80 yards to score a touchdown.
Oh my gosh.
And so they kind of had to call the play at that point. So he is kind of could go on that freaks list. And even now he showed up for the spring this year wearing number 0. I don't know if that's gonna hold for the fall, but I think just seeing a defensive tackle in 0, we all kind of were looking at him at practice one day and we're like, 0 usually makes like we joke that 0 usually makes a player look smaller. No, we think it made Emmanuel Bush look even bigger. Um, just an absolute kind of the guy on that defensive group right now. So I think he could definitely fall into that freaks list.
That's awesome. So, did do you know if any like power conference programs came to try to poach him?
I'm not 100% sure. I mean, he found his way to JMU from Marshall. He never entered the portal once he was here. I think he kind of just found his place and he fit in well with it.
Oh, that's great. So certainly one of those players that you'd watch through as like potential breakthrough studs for the 2025 season. So the interior of the defensive line seems really good. So when it comes to the pass rush, and we'll combine this with the linebackers, um, do you think the linebackers maybe pass rush could be the biggest question for James Madison this year?
Before kind of what they were able to add in the spring, I would have said that the linebacker was the one kind of question mark that this roster had, just because of how heavily they relied on Jacob Dobbs last year and Ray Scott and Taurus Jones once Jacob Dobbs was hurt, Taurus Jones really stepped up, and all of those guys are out of eligibility now. That being said, I think very highly of Trent Hendrick at linebacker, and it was just kind of who's going to filter in next to him because I think he can have a breakout year on a national level this year. He hasn't national or even not even national, but Sun Belt level, especially last year, it was a very talented linebacker group that was in the Sun Belt. And he just hasn't picked up those all conference honors yet, but I think he is someone now entering his senior season that has put in the work to get there. And even in the spring game, kind of with Sahir West, he was getting after the quarterback the most from the linebacker position. And he's really stepped up as a leader of kind of that front group on the defensive side of the ball. So I think he is someone that I think is going to make sure the work he puts in kind of raises the group up around him. And they have gone out and they've added some linebackers. They've added a really talented young guy, Jaden Studio from Kent State. So it's definitely a position group that they addressed. And I think it's one that's getting better. But it's one that, I think it's still a little interesting because you have a guy like Gannon Weathersby who hasn't been an every down linebacker quite yet, but he is still talented and he showed that in the Boca Raton Bowl. So it's one of those position groups that I would have said I was the most nervous about heading into the spring football practice and into the spring transfer window just because of the production that they lost last year.
Do you think it's a group that will probably need to stay healthy?
I think it's one that they're definitely going to win and hope it stays healthy, especially compared last year. It did take some hits with Dobbs and Ray Scott both getting hurt, but I think it's one Trent Hendrick played in every single game last year, didn't really have the injury bug. So it's one I think they're feeling confident in that he is able to stay healthy. And I think the younger guys and the guys around him, again, didn't play as much as he did last year, but all also stayed healthy. So it's one of those that if they don't stay healthy, they're going to need a young guy that maybe hasn't filled that role quite yet to step up.
And when you look towards the defensive secondary, so there will be some new faces here as well, but Logan or Chauncey Logan returns, Jacob Thomas returns, DJ Barksdale returns, and he was one of the top defensive backs last year in terms of total tackles. How does the secondary look in your opinion?
Well, so Chauncey actually ended up leaving really late. He was,
Oh, okay.
yeah, he left within like a day or two of the portal closing. He's now at Memphis. Um, he had a very interesting kind of run with this coaching staff, and none of us were ever able to get like kind of a straight answer in the press conferences about what was going on, if it was injury, if it was him not fitting what they were trying to run. So I think there was a possibility he was going to be cornerback number one going into the season, but Chance Harley comes in from Maryland. I've never seen someone so focused before practice than Chance Harley. We would get to practice, media all got let in like right at the start, and he was already out on the field juggling and just working on like that eye contact with the ball. And Makai Rogers comes in from St. Francis, and I think the coaching staff has been very high on him and what he was able to do. He's fast and he's tall. So I think this group, even without Chauncey Logan, is still really good. And you mentioned DJ Barksdale. I think he was probably the most underrated player on that defense last year as the nickel. I think he when they played North Carolina, they had him going up against North Carolina's tight ends for a while. So that was a big size mismatch, especially for someone he was a sophomore last year. But he really learned from that and he grew and he got so much better as it went on. And around the Georgia Southern game, it ends up being a loss, but he kind of gives the team a little bit of a spark with a pick six. And from there, it was kind of like no looking back for him. Boca Raton Bowl for him was just like this massive success. He was the defensive MVP. He had multiple big plays, and he's someone that I think was really going to help in multiple areas. It's something like even mentioning the linebackers, if they need him up close and closer in the run game, he can be that kind of support system there too. So it's one that I wouldn't worry about the secondary aspect of JMU's defense as much as kind of the front part of it, but it's still one that does have some new faces that are going to step up. But they also, similar to Trent Hendrick at linebacker, they have Jacob Thomas at safety, who has been at JMU every year of his career and going into his senior year. I think he's going to be a really good leader in that group.
Do you think this defense is like coming into the year one of the best in the Sun Belt, like without question?
I think they'll be really good. There may be some growing pains early on, but I think for JMU's benefit, they're opening the season with an FCS opponent that they know. And so that can maybe help them just kind of figure out early on maybe what some issues are that they need to fix. But kind of like I mentioned earlier, even through all of these coaching changes that JMU has had, because it's a school that, coaches can get poached from every year since Mike Houston in 2016, it seems like these defenses have just gotten better and better, even with the transfer portal. So I still think it's going to be one that is very, very strong. And from the conversations that I've had with guys on the team, specifically with Trent Hendrick, he kind of compared the defenses that Colin Hitchler, the new defensive coordinator, is running similar to what Bryant Haynes under Kurt Cignetti was running. And he has obviously gone on to be a great coach at Indiana who's still getting talked about and made even in some head coaching opportunities. So I think it's still going to be a really good defense that they bring out.
Actually, I don't want to skip over special teams. I know that going into the spring, there was some questions with punter at the punting position, but they just recently picked up a new transfer there as well. So talk about the special teams.
Yeah, the punting position is ever changing. It even changed today, probably about 30 minutes before getting on this. Lexington Matthews did enter the portal. So that was one that it was a little weird because for a while we were questioning other media members. We were questioning if there were three punters on this roster or if it was two, if it was one. We knew that Andrew Vance had taken his name out of the portal and was coming back. He wasn't with the team during the Boca Raton Bowl because he had already entered the portal at that point. But he comes back right pretty much in the weeks or two after the spring game. He's back on the roster. They add Patrick Rea from Louisiana Tech, who I had a chance to talk to about this time last week. And I think he's someone that JMU fans will really like because he's an Australian punter and JMU has a history of loving its Australian punters. And so now there's a little bit more of a clearer picture on the punting aspect that it's going to be Andrew Van Slyke and Patrick Rea on the team. Who ends up being the starter, I'm not 100% sure. They're two very different styles of punting. Van Slyke has worked very closely over the last several months and weeks with Ryan Hansen to improve his game, JMU's former punter. So it's going to be a fun group. Kicker, they lost Noe Ruelas to, the transfer portal, but I'm big on Cristiano Rosa. I think he can still be a really great addition, and he's been great at kickoffs, but then, they went out and they added another kicker from FAU just last week who can probably handle the actual place kicking responsibilities. So the specialists, it's a group that I think will still be very consistent and good.
When discussing the expectation for JMU in 2025, what do you think a realistic lookout would be for 2025?
I think and from JMU fans, this is the history of it. They haven't had a losing season since 2002, and since then there've been two national titles, a seamless transition to the FBS, and they expect them to win, and they expect them to be in the conversation for that Sun Belt title. And I think when you're in the Sun Belt, and if you're winning the Sun Belt, that then puts you in conversation to being one of the top G5 programs and possibly getting into the college football playoffs. So I know that there are a lot of fans that have that expectation for this team to be one of the G5 teams vying for that college football spot. But I think to even just start with that, I think there's a heavy desire to finally get the Sun Belt title in Harrisonburg.
I know last year after JMU beat North Carolina, a lot of people's outlook changed for JMU. Like, hey, this is one of the best G5 teams in the nation, and they did finish as one of those top G5 teams. Obviously, Boise State went on a roll there in the second half of the season, especially. Um, but yeah, JMU is going to be at least one of the best Sun Belt teams this season, and they'll have a chance to make some national noise as they take on the Louisville Cardinals in week 2. So that'll be a really fun contest to go on the road and take on Louisville there. Yeah, really interesting to see how this JMU team will perform this year. All right, one last question here for you, Katie.
Okay.
If JMU has a huge breakthrough season and they are one of those G5 teams in the last half of November going into December, looking at potentially being that G5 representative in the college football playoff, what player or players do you think would need to have a huge season for JMU to hit their ceiling, so to speak?
I think you need, and I think the thing too is JMU's this season is probably going to be one of the hardest schedules that JMU plays. And with that, I think you need whoever ends up being your starting quarterback, if it's Sluka, if it's Coleman, if Barnett ends up being healthy before then, you need them to be about as consistent as they can be week in and week out. Um, I would say if I had to narrow it down, just not going with the easy answer of quarterback, I would say I have like about three right now that I would say. I think you need George Pettaway to be kind of the guy he was last year, even with all of the other talent in the running back room. He was almost 1,000-yard rusher. I think you want him to have a good season. I think you need a wide receiver like Jalen Sanchez to really, really step up and kind of be a consistent ball hawk because they did have some drop problems last year with their slot receiver. And then on defense, I've talked about him heavily. I think Trent Hendrick is most likely going to be the captain of the defense. And I think he's one that if he can step up in that linebacker position, that defense should be okay.
Well, Katie, really good job going over the James Madison Dukes. Uh, but one last time, please tell our followers, our subscribers, and our viewers where they can find your content.
Yep, I'm over on Twitter at Katie Harper, Katie with a C.
Well, again, Katie, really good job. We appreciate you being on the channel, and we'll look to have you on the Gridiron Expert this time next year.